start there. I don't know whether the others are coming in or not. Here they are. So we'll be, they usually turn up a bit late, don't they? So we'll see. So I've got some handouts for you for today. There you go.
Thank you.
And a bit later on, I will give you a text which we'll have a look at. Where's that out of the way? I think what would be a good idea when the other two come. This is Jean-Luc Marion. This is the philosopher that we're looking at for the next 3 weeks or so. And he gives a good explanation about what he thinks he's doing as a philosopher of religion and so on. So I thought I will run the tape, as it were, and play that to you before the end of this session if I can. And certainly if those others turn up as well, we can therefore talk about that. So I want to talk to you today then about Jean-Luc Marion, and also a little bit about what is continental philosophy of religion. So I think both of you, I don't know whether you, Sonny, have done the critical.
Yeah.
Have you done that? Yeah, you handed it in. You took some extension leave, I know, a bit longer.
Yeah. Actually, my deadline is tomorrow. I haven't submitted, but I haven't finished it.
No worries. Okay, don't worry about it. Take your time. But you'll notice that the next assessment is January. And really what that's asking you to do is just to choose some challenging aspect of the course, i.e. things that you found interesting or difficult, and to write about that. But also what it's asking you to do is think a bit about what is continental philosophy of religion, what's its character. And so it's saying, it's asking you to describe what you think about Kant, Hegel, or Marian, or Heidegger, or Paul Ricoeur, and what makes them more of a continental philosopher of religion than, say, an analytic one. So some of the quotes I've given you on this handout is designed to talk a bit about that particular issue. In the first quote, hang on, I'll just write on the board. You need to see the number for this one. That's the code for today. So, just looking at this particular first quote on your handouts on John Caputo. Now, John Caputo is a famous postmodern philosopher of religion. So he's a chief spokesperson, I suppose, for the postmodernist perspective. In particular, people like he's the main, if you think about Heidegger, which I was talking about last time, Caputo is a big sort of supporter of Heidegger's views. And really he states very clearly what he thinks about postmodernism. Now, as you probably know, postmodernism is that reaction against modernism and the Enlightenment, the idea that the Enlightenment in the West and its ideas of reason and rationality is, impossible. We can only adopt the position of taking a location. So, an Enlightenment philosopher like Kant or Hegel would think that you could stand above the action, that you could sort of look down from the rational point of view, that your reason was alone sufficient. Whereas a postmodernist says, well, no, there are just different locations. There's a Chinese perspective, there's an Indonesian perspective, there's an English perspective, there's a German perspective, there's a Japanese perspective. We all come from our different places. So the Enlightenment, that was just effectively just Westernism trying to be exported to the rest of the world. And so postmodernism effectively is a kind of awareness of the limitations of modernism and its pretensions to seek to interpret the whole world. So listen to what he actually says here. Postmodernism effectively put a lot of what the Enlightenment was trying to sell us on the run. And good riddance. Good riddance to the idea of pure, worldless, solipsistic subjects, to the ideal of pure presuppositionalist science, to the pure pre-linguistic world, to pure objects, to pure consciousness, to pure reason. Give us some good old-fashioned impure thoughts. The world is a lot more complicated than the moderns think, a lot messier, less well-programmed, less rule-governed, more open-ended, open-textured. The collective idea that human thinking turns on the ability to move along shifting perspectives, vocabularies, and paradigms we call the postmodern turn. So basically, Caputo is reacting against the modernistic tendency to try and find the pure thought, the pure this, the pure that. Instead, the world is messy. It's more complicated. You can never find the pure. You can only find the messiness or the context or the culture and so on. So what you find then in postmodernism is a great deal of what you find in postmodernism then is a great deal of emphasis on context. So the contextual philosopher is more important than the pure philosopher, so to speak. So, in what you would normally associate with philosophy of religion is the kind of analytic types. So for those of you who have studied philosophy of religion, the classic form, the Western form, you get attention to things like the problem of evil, or the existence of God, or life after death, or, and the analysis of religious language, all those sorts of things. And what you find in those kinds of ways of doing philosophy of religion is a very analytic, reason-driven analysis of religious faith. And you find classic examples of this, like you've got Richard Swinburne, Alvin Plantinga, William Lane Craig, Kant, all those kind of people who rest largely on the ideas of reason as being dominant. And the continental tradition effectively reacts against that analytic kind of approach. So I've given you some examples. The conversation between analytic philosophy of religion and continental philosophy has been attempted by such writers as J. Aaron Simmons, Bruce Benson, Merrill Vestal, Kevin Hart, Masterson, Nick Trakakis, and Kevin Schilbrack. These people have tried to bring the continental philosophers like Kant, Hegel, Heidegger together with the analytic American style logic. Now, is it possible? Because, of course, if you saw a couple of weeks ago, Heidegger wants to emphasize poetry. Poetry is illuminating. You can't illuminate religion by talking rationally. You have to talk in terms of poetry. So, you might think, how is it possible to bring together analytic logic traditions with poetry in the continental traditions? Well, I've given you a few articles. You'll see that next paragraph. There's a number of articles, and I've actually put them online. So if you look at this, just go and have a quick look at the screen. Here, I can find it, there it is. If you see there, I've given you loads, at least two. So there's part of the question for the second essay in January, ask you, what's continental philosophy trying to do? If you look at these two articles, one by Trakakis and one by J. Aaron Simmons, they're both published quite recently, they're trying to bring the two together. They're trying to say, how can the analytic philosophers of religion and the continentals speak to each other? And so that's quite an interesting couple of articles that you can download off Canvas if you have a look. If you have any problems accessing this, by the way, let me know. But both these articles are in the library and they're available online, so you should be able to access them as students. We'll look at this quote and this video in a minute of Jean-Luc Marion explaining what it is that he does. But if you're interested, and it might be useful to you when it comes to writing your future essay, but these two articles, and these other pieces here might help you engage in the discussion. What are, continental philosophers trying to do? And if you turn over the page of your handout, there's also another work by Elizabeth Burns. So if you just turn over the page, there's a great short book by Elizabeth Burns called Continental Philosophy of Religion. And this is what Elizabeth Burns says at the top of that page. She says, perhaps what philosophy of religion needs is a hybrid methodology, one which draws on both the reasoning skills of analytic philosophy and the existential emphasis of a broader range of tools, some originating from incognate disciplines of continental philosophy. So she thinks that, you can combine the analytic tools of philosophy of religion with the more existential, the kind of the lived aspects that you find within continental philosophy. So a classic existential philosopher would be Jean-Paul Sartre, who's talked about the feelings of the world being of nausea and so on. So he talked about existence as being important starting points for philosophy. Now, so what Elizabeth Burns argues there is that maybe you can bring the two arguments together, or the two ideas, that what continental philosophy of religion does is it reveals more about the nature of the world, which may be the topic then of a more analytic tradition. Now, it's all very well. It sounds obvious, doesn't it, to say let's join together analysis with existential thinking. But it's easier said than done. I remember somebody once came to this department to give a paper to talk about, Jean-Paul Sartre and Heidegger, and most of the analytic philosophers in this department just didn't understand it, or didn't understand where was the precision, where was the fine focus, where was the discernment of the differences, the black and white, the logic, and so on. So often you find that the discussion between the continentals and the philosophers, they don't understand each other. So this is the challenge of doing philosophy of religion, looking at people like Heidegger and Kant and Hegel, and this guy, Jean-Luc Marion. So, and there's a good book by Christina Gueshwanta, I think that's how you pronounce it, called Postmodern Apologetics. This is the next quote, characterizing new phenomenologists like Marion. So there's a term. Now, if you call, say, Alvin Planting or Richard Swinburne or William Lane Craig or one of the Islamic philosophers of religion, you would call people like Heidegger, Jean-Luc Marion, phenomenologists. Why? Because they're looking at the phenomena, they're looking at what's happening in the world. So Christina Gershwin writes this: these contemporary philosophers are thus concerned with very different questions than traditional either early or modern apologetic projects. Their emphasis is on showing that it is possible to describe religious experience phenomenologically, and that such depiction is meaningful. Most of them are quite critical of any attempt to prove God's existence. So if you were to come into the presence of this Jean-Luc Marion here, or Heidegger, and with an argument for the existence of God, so first cause, or there must be a designer, or the ontological argument, either must be God must exist, otherwise there would be a being greater than God. These postmodern philosophers or the phenomenologists would just laugh. They would say, forget it, it's ridiculous. What a silly discussion. God either is present or visible, or is experience you either take seriously or not. So if somebody comes into the room and says, I have experienced God, you don't say, let's work this out and get the calculator out. They say, Marion says, that's an irrelevant. You either take experience seriously or you don't. You either say they're telling the truth or you don't. What's the analysis that you use, therefore, to judge an experience? And that basically is the root of the dispute is the experience of religion too big, too complex, too rich for a logic philosopher to grasp. So they're critical of the attempt to be logical in the face of a much greater experience that needs to be understood. Now, when I've talked about that to other students in the past, they've said, well, you know, aren't we allowed to talk logically? Can't we use our rationality to engage the world? You know, what's the problem? And maybe that's a good point. Maybe in some ways, one criticism is that the phenomenologists like Marianne and Heidegger are actually just effectively they're anti-intellectuals. You know, it's rather like if you're all intellectuals, what's the value of being an intellectual? Is the question. And so, you know, do the phenomenologists go excessively the other way? Do they emphasize too much experience, too much mysticism? And they don't allow enough analysis. This is the criticism, you see. So when you look at people like Heidegger or Kant, or even, maybe less so Kant, Kant's very, very logical and rational. But take Heidegger or Hegel. You try to read Hegel, it's impossible. You try to read Heidegger, it's very difficult. If you read Jean-Luc Marianus, you'll see in a minute, I've got some quote. He's not bad, he's okay, he's not too difficult. But part of the reason why they are difficult to read is the question, are they trying to say something that can't be said? Have they gone so far the other way in trying to describe experience that they've lost an ability to be precise? And that's why they're difficult to read, because they're trying to be too impressionistic. They're trying to say, is it something like this, and appeal to your existential feelings? But by doing that, they actually become quite difficult to understand or to comprehend. So, looking at the heading phenomenology on your handout. Now, I don't know whether Sunny you were there at the research methods that I was running, but no, Efri there, I know Yang you were there. Is that that's how to pronounce your name? Yang?
Yeah.
Okay.
Sunny is not from our school.
No, that's right. Oh, of course you're from a different school.
Yeah,
okay, I understand. I get it. Well, you two probably remember that one of the famous principles that's used in the study of religion and philosophy, and not less so philosophy, but more the social sciences, is Edmund Husserl. And Husserl, basically, Sonny, is somebody who wants to get back to experiences. They say, what's the method of approaching things in the world? Well, allow the things to speak for themselves without your prejudices. So imagine if I put that in the middle of the table and I said, what is that? And I said, I want you to leave the room, come back in again and tell me what that is, but I want you to forget as much as you can all that you've learned about what that object is. So we know it's a pen. But what the phenomenologists ask you to do is to put outside any presuppositions and come and just look at the object afresh without any prejudices or any theory. So you might say it's an object, it's long, it's got blue top to it, the top comes off, maybe it tastes right, no, you can't eat it, you know what I mean? So you try to come at an object afresh, and the idea is that by coming to the thing new, you see it again differently, and you see it for its first impression. So, partly what a phenomenologist like Husserl is trying to do is take you right back to the thing in itself before your theory and before your understanding. Now, is that possible? Wow. Listen to what he actually says. So I've given you a quote here, and Efri and Yang have already seen this, but I mean, you can see it again. It won't do you any harm. So listen to what I've written here, and then the quote is all very important. So Husserl's principle of all principles. Since metaphysics is often associated with investigations concerning objectivity or mind-independent reality behind appearances, analytic philosophers are likely to conflict with the orthodox phenomenology defined by Edmund Husserl's principle of all principles, where we get back to, or a reduction to, the things themselves, and that the principle of sufficient reason is not required on top of what we self-intuit directly. Most importantly, as nothing is required on top, all intuition occurs only against the horizon of immanence and finitude. Let me explain. So, what philosophers tend to do is the argument, is that they come along with metaphysics. That is, they're trying to apply structures and systems to everything that they look at. Okay? So Husserl, when he says get back to the things themselves and just get rid of all your principles of reason, don't apply a structure on top of your interpretations. Just go for the experience. What is the thing, as it were? And of course, philosophers don't like that because what they think they're being invited to do is suspend their intellect, to come without knowledge, to say, don't say it's a pen, to come in to say it's an object. And that seems counter philosophical, apparently. Listen to what he says, though. This is a quote I used again in the research methods, but he says, every originary presentive intuition is a legitimizing source of cognition. Every originary presentive intuition is a legitimizing source of cognition. Basically, your first impressions are valid. Every originary, first event, first sight is valid. You don't say, right, I can see it now, what is it really? That's a second question, says Husserl. That everything originally, so to speak, in its personal actuality, the thing offered to us in intuition, is to be accepted simply as what it is presented as being. So you don't ask any further questions than just what is the object, or what do I feel about what's being seen, my first intuition. So imagine if I sent you out of the room and it wasn't this. Maybe I got a surprise object and it hasn't. But imagine if I did and I sent you all out and I put the object there and I said, right, come in. What Husserl would say is your first impression of the object is the right perspective. It's the first thing you see, and your first feeling about it or intuition is valid. See what he's trying to do? It's not like Descartes. Descartes, the French philosopher, was really concerned about what is the basis of knowledge. And he said, well, I'm thinking. That I can't deny I'm thinking, therefore I think, therefore I am, says Descartes. Same sort of thing, Descartes was thirsty for knowledge. He wanted to know what could he be certain of. Now Husserl is the same. He says, what is the basic starting point, he asks, for certainty of knowledge? And he says, first impression, first intuition, first sight, before any interpretation. That must be what it is. So that's his prejudice. That's what he's saying to you. View the thing as it is, there and then, without theory. Now, if you look at the final bit, what he says, but only within the limits in which it is presented there. Now, what does he mean by that last phrase, only within the limits in which it is presented there? He means, now this is the controversy, only that moment matters. Only the framework of your own understanding and impression and intuition counts. You and the object is the limitation. Now, you'll see that Mario disagrees with that. He says, well, actually what Husserl is doing is he's actually doing what Kant's done. Kant said, we see things through our own perspectives. Husserl is trying to break away from that. Can you see? He's trying to say, don't come with any structuring interpretation, because Kant thought that you structure the world according to your own intellect and your own structure. Husserl is trying to say, put that to one side and just see the object. So when he says at the end, but only within the limits in which it is presented there, Husserl seems to be contradicting it almost. He's almost saying, that there is a limit. There is a kind of like the moment itself is the limitation, or really, it's a finite limitation. So you're finite, I'm finite, we're all limited, as it were, and Husserl is saying we can't get beyond the finite apprehension of an object. Now, Marion says, yes, we can. Okay? Because there's one term you'll come across later on. You see, so take a phenomenon. This is what Husserl would say, is that there is a phenomenon. This pen is a phenomenon. And you see it for the first time. What Marion says, as you'll see in a minute, is he says, we're not limited by our own perceptions, so that phenomenon can be saturated. What does saturated mean? You know what I mean by saturated? What's saturation, do you know? Do you want me to do a physical demonstration? I can pour this water over my head and I will be saturated because I will be covered in it. So what Marion says is that when you encounter something so amazing, it can saturate your comprehension and your perception. Now he says that the mistake that people like Kant make in saying the world is structured by our own mind is that everything then is within my own mind. And similarly, Husserl, when he says only within the limits in which it is presented there, is implying that I can't get beyond that thing there, then. So does the language of Husserl fall into the same trap of limiting things according to my experiences? And Marion's basic question is this: is it possible to break out of those limits of our knowledge and our knowing? Is it possible to say that there are things there that speak to us without the limitations of our own mind, that seems to overflow? And he calls it then the saturated phenomenon, as you'll come across a bit later on in a future week. Now, okay, that's the first thing. Now, I said that because that's one of the basic starting points for understanding Jean-Luc Marion. He's very much into seeing the thing in itself, but he wants to go further than Husserl and say we can break out of our own perceptions. Now, the second influence on Marion is Heidegger. And you've already encountered a bit of Heidegger a few weeks ago. And this may be a quote I may have used, but I'll use it again. So Heidegger writes, when metaphysics thinks of beings with respect to the ground that is common to beings as such, then its logic is ontologic. When metaphysics thinks of beings as such as whole, that is, with respect to the highest being which accounts for everything, then its logic as theologic. Basically, Heidegger's point, if you remember from a few weeks ago, was to say that philosophy is dominated by a theological ghost. There's a sense that when philosophers talk about being or metaphysics, by their interpretations of reality as a whole, he says they are accidentally becoming theologians. They talk as if somehow there's a ground of being or there's an ultimate answer. How do they know that? Where do philosophers get the idea that they're trying to get to a lower being or a ground? And he says, well, that's because secretly it's theology in disguise. And so, is it possible? So now it works two ways, as you saw a couple of weeks ago. Philosophy becomes infected with theology, but he says also theology becomes infected with philosophy. It starts to talk about God like the philosophers do. It starts to talk about being, about metaphysics. And what Heidegger challenges, and Marion agrees, is that maybe God is beyond metaphysics. Maybe God is beyond all being, if you know what I mean. So taking over the page again. Theology is a positive science. It's real. It's to do with how you feel, the reality, the lived experience. And as such, therefore, is absolutely different from philosophy. This is Heidegger. I wonder if you agree with that, Does he mean that when you are doing theology, you can't be a philosopher? That's a very radical point, isn't it, really? I mean, what does he want us to do? Does he want us again to subject ourselves to just pure experience and not think? This is the challenge. So okay, Heidegger says theology isn't philosophy. So what do we do next? What does he want us to do? Is he effectively approving of theology by setting it free from philosophy? Or is he, in the end, putting theology down, saying it's not a thinking science, so to speak? Well, these are the things you can think about. And then there's this very famous quote, which some of you did notice, by the way, in the short critical commentary, which some of you did really very well indeed, by the way. I'm just middle marking them, but you've done very well. God is given a philosophical name, causa sui, but the problem is that before the causa sui, man can neither fall to his knees in all, nor can he play music or dance before this God. Then he makes the striking remark, this is what Heidegger says, the godless thinking which must abandon the God of philosophy, God as causa sui, is thus perhaps closer to the divine God. Here this means only godless thinking is more open to him than ontotheologic would like to admit. Again, just to repeat, what he's saying there is that maybe the appreciation of God without thinking is closer to the real God than the philosophers are. Do you know what I mean? Now, why am I mentioning that again? Because one of the most famous books that Jean-Luc Marion wrote, and which I will show you a selection from in a week or two, is called God Without Being. Now, you think, looking at that, God without being, that Marion was an atheist, that he was trying to be, an atheist. Wrong. Because following Heidegger's logic, he's trying to say God is not limited by philosophy. God explodes beyond or saturates far beyond what philosophy can do. God isn't just a being, God is beyond being. Now, some philosophers in America think that someone once described Marion. They said, yeah, it's very nice, but it's ridiculous. What's he saying? God without being? Well, what do you think, I wonder? Because Heidegger thinks that he's setting religion free from philosophy. Other people think it's just poetry got mad. It's a mysticism that is anti-intellectual. Well, that's your opinion, depending where you stand on all that. But I think Marion is if you read his work, it's magnificent. But it may also be very obscure and strange. Anything you want to explain further? Anything you didn't understand about that, or anything you want to talk about, or anything that occurs to you, or you think what you didn't understand? Or I know it's difficult sometimes, but do you want to talk about it?
Without being doesn't mean God is not existent.
No, he doesn't think. If you ever watch a clip of him, and there's lots of clips of him on YouTube, effectively he's a very devout Catholic. So he believes very much. So he doesn't mean by that God has no being. He just means that God is beyond being.
Back to the first, your statement, when Marion want to put together, does it mean combine, put together, similar with combine?
Yeah, well, no, you'll see in the reading I give you in a second, Metaphysics and Phenomenology, which is the first reading. We're going to go through a few little short passages and we'll try to understand them together. But he thinks he's against metaphysics. He thinks that classic analytic philosophy of religion is over. Mm-hmm. And he thinks the new philosophy is the kind of philosophy that he does, which is the phenomenology type philosophy that we've just roughly discussed. I think he's wrong, because I think there's clearly a great future for analytic philosophy of religion. It's no question it's still going on. So this is the question. I mean, what you find is a lot of philosophers think that they are the future. And, you know, different philosophers of different viewpoints think that as well. So Marian is not trying to bring it together every. He's not trying to join analytics with continentals. He's really just going for the continental because he thinks he can say more, as you'll see in a minute. Any other questions? Yeah. Okay. So let's look at Jean-Luc Marion then. He's a famous French philosopher, currently still alive, so you can write to him. He's a Roman Catholic theologian as well as a philosopher, so he's actually quite a religious man. And he's famous in France for being a specialist in Descartes. So if you were to go to France, Paris, and say, have you heard of Jean-Luc Marion? They would say, oh yes, he's an expert in Descartes. Whereas if you go to America and Europe and Britain and say, do you know Jean-Luc Marion? They'll say, oh yes, he's that phenomenologist, that famous philosopher. So he's not known for philosophy of religion in France. He's known for being a scholar of Descartes. But in Britain and in America, he's famous for being a philosopher of religion. So he had a very distinguished early life. He ended up studying at the Sorbonne in Paris, and ended up teaching there. And so he was very quite a young man actually. He was only 24 when he started teaching in Sorbonne and Poitiers from 1980 onwards, and he was born in. No, that's wrong. I'm wrong about that, aren't I? What am I talking about? He was 34. Yeah, 34, which is still quite young. Then he became director of philosophy at Paris Nanterre, and then again in Sorbonne in Paris. But from about 20 or 30 years or so, he's been a professor at Chicago Divinity School. So he moved to America, and he was made an immortal by the French government. So he was made a member of the Académie Française. So you get a seat in the Académie Française, and you get to wear these robes. So he's a very distinguished French philosopher or thinker. So let's look at his themes, and let's talk about them. What does he mean? So he said, now these are two major themes: givenness and excess. The big theme is givenness, and the second theme is excess. So let's talk about that. So let's see what he says about givenness in the quote. Givenness precedes intuition and abolishes its Kantian limits, because the fact of being given to consciousness in whatever matter testifies to the right of phenomena to be received as such, that is to say, as they give themselves. To return to the things themselves amounts to recognizing phenomena as themselves without submitting them to the sufficient condition of an anterior authority, such as the thing in itself, cause or principle. So what is he saying? Well, basically, a thing gives itself, like my pen, before intuition, and abolishes Kant's idea that we only see the thing through our own eyes. So Kant had two distinctions, didn't he? Do you remember that? I don't know if Nick Adams talked about it. He said there's a noumenal world, a noumenal world, and then there's a phenomenal world. So there is a noumenal sunny.
Yeah.
There is the thing. There's the sunny in herself, but then there are three phenomenological sunnies as we perceive you.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
So there is the thing, you, but then there's Ephraim, Yang, and David's viewpoint. Kant thinks we can never get beyond the phenomenon. We can never see the thing, sunny, or this chair, or this pen in itself. Now, what Marian says in this passage is that let's abolish. Now, what he says effectively is something like this: is let's make the phenomenal the noumenal. Let's break through the boundary of trying to put this layer and let the phenomenal be saturated and just overflow. So we do see you, but you are so complex that we can never completely understand you, but we nonetheless have a real experience that can't be just through my own mind. So what Marion is trying to say is he wants the thing in itself to give itself as an overflow and to abolish Kant's distinction between the mind and the world. He says, let the thing just speak, cancel the the noumenal, and make this the priority, the phenomenal that speaks for itself. Now, so givenness precedes intuition, he says at the top, and abolishes its Kantian limits, because the fact of being given, this is the term he uses a lot, being given. It's almost like a category. So what is this? It's the being given. It's almost like that's what it is. And he says, allow this to speak for itself, regardless of your intuition. So he's being Husserlian. He's following Husserl and being phenomenological. But he's going beyond Husserl by abolishing intuition. He thinks that, so he says, this is what you think about priorities. So if you think, what's the first thing happens when you see this object, when you come in the room? So I come in the room and I see the pen, and you might say, my first impression, this is what Husserl thought, my first originary intuition is the starting point of knowledge. Marion says, no. What goes before the intuition? Before I come in. So he says, no, the thing in itself gives itself. Then I intuit. So he's put one thing in front of intuition, the givenness of something. The sheer givenness of the world, the givenness of your presence, the givenness of this chair. Then I see and have an intuition. So he's got this kind of phenomenology where he's trying to work out what are the roots of experience. And if you're going to allow the thing to really speak, it has to give itself. And not surprisingly, one of the major themes in continental philosophy and theology is this thing called the gift. Now, this is a very powerful idea in 20th and 21st century thought, the gift. Now, so think of what is a gift? A gift comes undeserved. If it's not a gift, it's a reward. So you might think, well, a gift has to be earned. Nope. That wouldn't be a gift. It would be a reward. So, Effie, if I say, I've got a gift for you, I give you, if it's a real gift, it's a gift to you regardless of how well you've written your essay. So, it's just a gift. And there's no reward associated with it. There's no cause and effect. See the point? It just arrives. Now, what Marianne says, effectively, is that knowledge is a gift. It just comes without reward or without seeking or knowing or acquiring or learning. See the point? And that's the category he wants you to think about. He wants you to think about gift as being the priority or the thing that even precedes anything else. So if you were to go back to this, I'm going to frame this as God without being. What is now God as Marianne understands it? God is a gift. It's entirely given. There is no category being used to operate how we apprehend God. God just arrives, bang, a gift. And so he says theology effectively occupies the gift. And that's his point. Now he wants to make that, he does that over many, many thousands of words. he has a rich discussion about the gift, and that's what he does. It's a phenomenology of wanting to say, what is the starting point? It's not being, it's not metaphysics, it's the given. And the being given is the category he's trying to describe. Okay, so that's the first thing that's a big theme in Marion. What time is it tonight? Oh yeah, got some time. I'll just do this next bit, then we'll have a bit of a break for you, and you can scratch your head a bit further. So the second extension of this, another big theme, is excess. This is fascinating. Marion then says this: can the givenness in presence of each thing be realized without any conditional restriction? Now, what does he mean by that? Well, let's just stop there for a second and think about what he says about Kant. Kant says you can only see things through your own eyes. You only can access the phenomenal, not the noumenal thing in itself. Which means that when you have an idea of God, you can only see God in your own eyes. You know what I mean? So he says, is it possible for the givenness of something, if the givenness takes priority, if the gift is the starting point, is it possible even to break out of your own mind, such that there's an overflow that goes beyond? Can you really encounter God as God actually is? Big thought. So he writes this: if phenomenology is concerned with reduction, back to the things themselves, then surely, he argues, this phenomenological reduction needs to continue to strip away all our conceptual obstructions in order to allow the thing to give itself. That is, Marion's radical proposal is that the sheer givenness of phenomena means freeing it from the limits of every other authority, including intuition. So that's just basically that's the basic idea, that he thinks that you must allow the thing in itself to fully give itself without limitation, intuition, intellect, structure. Just, is it possible for the given to be utterly free to give itself without our interpretations? What do you think? Do you think we're always going to be limited by our minds? Is he describing impossibilities, or? As he talks about this as being the impossible. Any thoughts? Or was it too big a thought? But this is the point, isn't it? When I remember reading this to other students, and they said, "Oh, this is I like this because it seems to be describing something that sounds very religious. The idea of something that breaks out of boundaries, that saturates the mind, overflows. But it also sounds a bit weird. He seems to be trying to conceptualize something that he can't conceptualize. He's trying to say that there are objects that are so huge and so overflowing that we can't, that it's allowed to give itself as it is. But how could that be possible? Surely our minds still limit things. And if you're thinking that, it's a good question. But Marion wants to say, is it possible to go the whole way with phenomenology and allow the givenness of something to be total and absolute before our knowledge of it? That's his philosophical question. So what
if I ask where gift actually comes?
Where does it come?
Yeah.
He's describing what a phenomenologist does is that he or she tries to describe what does it feel like to experience the world. Mm-hmm. And he thinks that one way of looking at the world is that somehow the world seems to overflow and overwhelm you. And what the philosophers like Kant are describing is if we're in control. Mm-hmm. And that's the point, isn't it? Is that if you are a philosopher or a metaphysician and you're trying to understand the world and argue, effectively, you're controlling. And Marion says, isn't our experience of the world overwhelming? So isn't there something about the way the world is experienced that in fact isn't under our control? And is that a more true view of the world as being an almost impossible, but nonetheless we feel it's the case? Now, I think it's interesting and it's a good point, but then I see, I'm working on material like this all the time, and I'm puzzled. I'm trying to think, what am I going to do with this? Where do I take it? Is it just nice? Do I eventually become a scholar who ends up talking a lot about light and saturation? But what do you do with it?
Yeah.
Now, this is what the problem is. If I was to pass this knowledge on to another like you, you might ask the question, what was David Cheatham doing? What was I trying to get you to do? Am I trying to be poetical? Do I persuade by beauty or narrative, or what's my strategy? And am I contributed to how we understand the world? So could you go and do something? Could you see other philosophers who do analytic philosophy and logic help you to build cars, make light bulbs, learn how a mobile phone works, and it works. See, that's the proof. This is good philosophy. It works. But Heidegger and Marianne and Husserl are trying to understand how we experience the world and saying, if you describe things this way, you see more. But it doesn't make this work better, or the light bulbs come on. So, you might want to think about when you write your essays, what's all this about? How do we use it? I'd be very interested to know, not today, but what you might think is the value of this stuff, yeah.
Is it possible, like, for example, if you're a researcher within the realm of continental philosophy, is it okay if you don't have a solid research question in you're not gonna try to, prove something right or wrong?
A very clever question. Well, I suppose the research question that Marianne is saying, how do I encapsulate, sorry, we'll have a break. How do we encapsulate religion? Look at the title of this piece I'm about to give you. Metaphysics, a relief for theology. So, theology has always been, his view, shackled, imprisoned by metaphysics and philosophy of being. So let's relief for theology and return to the things of themselves, the gift, allow God to saturate all being and so on. So that's the research question would be, how can I relieve theology? Maybe. But you might say you're not relieved. Because when I talk to philosophers of religion about, their way of doing philosophy, they say, this is upsetting. This is not helpful. This is taking us away from knowledge. So maybe it's not useful. Maybe it's a disguised distraction. That's your viewpoint. Right, let's have a break. So it's now 5 to 2. Come back at 10 past 2. All right, so you've got 15 minutes break. Go and get a coffee, but don't be too late. And then we'll carry on and try and read some of this as well. So, okay.